Hey guys, TheAirsoftTech here. Today we're going to be starting a new build series. Well, this is a new build series for you guys. This is a finished build for me, but I'm going to take you guys through it in a 3-part series. So this very first part of the build series is going to focus on the lower half of the Gearbox Shell. So you can kind of think of it in terms of the lower receiver. So retro arms Gearbox Shells, or the ones that you can buy, can come in a 2-piece, kind of like ICS. They don't necessarily split apart like ICS, but they do split. And so we're going to be going over what all I did in the lower half of the gearbox and the motor. Just as I said before, this gun has a lot of cool parts to it. So we got the retro arms Gearbox Shell, which comes in a 1- and 2-piece setup. The hop unit is clearly attached. And then we have a really cool set of externals too, which will look really cool once we get the whole gun put together in the final part. But just for this part, we're going to be going over the lower half of the Gearbox Shell and the motor. So let's get started on the lower half of the Gearbox Shell. So the lower half of these retro arms Gearbox Shells are made out of the same thing that the top are made out of. They're made out of aluminum and they're CNC'd. This happens to be black. They can come in gray, they can come in white, or well, silver, but this one comes in black. It has 8mm bearing slots or bushing slots as well. So for this build we used bushings everywhere except on the sector. That's how he included it. And I don't see much of a problem with that. The sector does actually not bear a lot of weight. It's usually the lower half of the spur gear that bears the most weight. So on the spur gear, I almost always have bushings. Sometimes on the bevel, I'll use bearings, but I try to stay away from bearings. If you're gonna need to replace something in one of these builds, it's either gonna be the bearings or the piston. So I tend to use as much durable of a part as I can. So those are what we're using for there. So the gear set that we're using is actually, and if you have a keen eye, you can kind of tell these apart just from experience. So this lower half, this spur gear is an XYT, most likely JG, Echo 1, something like that. Same thing with the bevel. You can actually see on the bevel, it says GE, which when we say XYT, we're just really meaning like ACM. Though there is a brand of gears that are stamped XYT, I kind of just tend to say XYT and ACM are kind of the same thing, even though they're not technically. And then obviously we're using the 8-tooth Riot SC. This is one of the earlier versions of the DSG. This is a really old DSG gear actually. This is probably one of his first ones. The newer ones do not look the same as this one does. And this is a Gen 1. Very obviously you can tell what this is right here. This is the Gate Titan MOSFET right here. This is a really cool MOSFET. I actually kind of like it a little bit more than the BTC Spectra, but that's a totally different video. I will make a video on that coming up as soon as I can get a Gate Titan for myself and compare them side by side, because I haven't had the money to spend on a Gate Titan. I've spent money on other things. So we have the Gate Titan here, obviously, which is the version 2 setup. It's set up a lot like the BTC Spectra, where it has the lead wire, or has the gate wire with the other 2 wires going back and forth. And then we have a retro arms red trigger here. And of course, what I've done to it is I've shimmed the gears to as close to perfection as I possibly can. I use a combination of SHS and GMP copper shims. I tend to find that these 2 shims work really well together. So what I tend to do is I use the GMP gear shims on the lower half of the bevel gear. And the reason why I do this is because the SHS shims are a little bit wider, which the wider they are, they can actually catch on the spur. So if you use thin shims for the lower half of the bevel, you're less likely to have that catching concept there. And so that's really the only place that I use those shims, because SHS shims can be a bit thinner in certain types. So I used the SHS shims everywhere else. As you can see, I don't have a single shim on top of the sector gear here, only because it's actually running flawlessly. If you don't need a shim, don't use a shim. Some people try to use a shim anyway just because it acts as a barrier between the gear and the bushing, or in this case the bearing, but I don't necessarily see a problem in having my sector gear here touching the bearing without a shim. As long as it's shimmed appropriately, personally don't see a problem. So with bearings, you're going to want to leave a little bit more leeway between the bearing and the gear than you would if you have a bushing. And the reason is you do not want to blow these bearings out. You want to give them plenty of room as possible. So between bushings, you want to get them as tight as possible on that gear to still allow maximum rotation without as much resistance. So you want a little bit of movement, but with bearings, you want a little bit more movement. As you're probably aware, when you install one of these Gate Titan MOSFETs, or a BTC Spectra MOSFET, or even a Chimera Mark II, you're going to find that you're not going to need a lot of parts right here. You're not going to need the safety bar, you're not going to need the cutoff lever, you're not going to need anything like that. because this replaces everything. And that's just awesome, because half the problems that you experience in a DSG build, in my experience, are heavily related to the cutoff lever, and that's really about it. Cutoff lever and FPS are two issues that people who build DSGs tend to have. So the cutoff lever likes to just not cut off correctly. Sometimes it cuts off late, sometimes it doesn't cut off at all, sometimes it cuts off way too early. You tend to have a bunch of issues whenever you speed a process up a lot like you do in a DSG. So I really like using these types of MOSFETs for DSG builds. I've never had a problem with the gate FET. I've installed a lot of them actually, and every single one I've installed has not had an issue with overheating or handling an intense DSG build, kind of like this one. Something anyone building a airsoft gun should know, especially when you have a lot of wires running through here, is how to guide your wires. If you don't guide your wires appropriately, you're going to shred them, and that happens a lot to even people who know what they're doing. They'll just forget to tuck their wires in well, or forget to lay them out appropriately, and then they shove the motor in and they find out that they just tore right through their signal wire. So I tuck my wires really well, and if they don't stay, I wrap them in tape like I did this time, and just shove them underneath of where they are. So some builds, or some gearboxes, actually have a little latch to where you can tuck the wires underneath. So a lot of gearbox shells don't have this latching area here for the wire. Some do, but some don't. So a lot of ACM, a lot of even upgrade gearbox shells like Lonex don't have this little latch here where you can tuck the wires and latch them underneath. But RetroArms does, and that's a really awesome feature that I like. But if you take the gate wires, which are kind of thin, but they're still 16 gauge, so just thinly insulated, then you try to shove them underneath, and you're going to find out that they want to keep shoving themselves back up. So what you can do is you can wrap them in a little bit of electrical tape to create kind of like a shimming concept here, to where you can lash the wires underneath and they'll stay there. And that's what happened here. I shoved them underneath, I found that they were coming up, and so when they kept coming up, I just wrapped them in one little piece of electrical tape, and now they stay right where they are, and there's going to be no risk of shredding those wires whenever someone takes the motor in and out to do regular maintenance, or if, say, the motor height jumps down and shreds the wires won't be there to be shredded. So that's one thing you can do to help prolong your wire setup. Alright, so we have the lower half of our gearbox shell together. Lighting's kind of funny because this is a black gearbox shell with all black components, but we're going to test out a few things here. One of the things I test out in any high performance build is the anti-reversal latch to make sure it's actually working. So obviously our gears should go backwards. Well, technically I guess that's forwards if you're working towards the gun working, but the sector gear is rotating backwards, which is appropriate because it's going to be pulling back the piston. But I want to make sure our anti-reversal latch is working, which it is, which if I pull back and I shove it forward, I don't get anything. Now, under weight, this could change very drastically, but this is a good first test. And you can hear how many times it clicks. So I just barely moved the sector gear forward and it clicked. Barely moved it again, clicked. There we go. So for really about every single half tooth the sector gear is moving forward, we get a click. And it feels nice and strong. So you can also test out shimming like this, but you should really test out shimming without the anti-reversal latch in. But this is how it sounds. And don't test whether your shimming is good by the amount of rotations you get, because that's not how you do that. I believe I've covered that in my shimming guide video, but you really test out shimming by testing out the play between each gear. And that's really what you do. But, you know, it's always fun to rotate your gears. And these sound pretty good to me. So one of the issues I ran into with this build, and that a lot of people run into when they mix and match a lot of different parts together, even if they are high quality parts like this receiver here and this Magpul style grip, maybe a GMP brand, I don't know, is that you're going to have a lot of issues with grip alignment. And I'm being really careful with this grip for the next part, or for the next thing I'm going to say. This grip alignment here can really screw up your gearbox shell. Shimming, it can really screw up your bevel gear, it can screw up your pinion gear if it's kind of soft. Usually pinion gears are a lot harder than their bevel gears that they touch. So you really want to pay attention to the way you are, not necessarily just shimming, but the way your grip connects to your receiver with the gearbox shell inside, because if you're not paying attention, then you can really shred the bevel gear. So even if you're great at shimming, you'll shred the bevel gear because it'll screw up your angle. And so what I did is I took some small shims, you can see them in there. They're GMP 0.2 millimeter shims. There are 6 on each screw, so there's 1.2 millimeters of space on each screw. And what this is going to do is it's going to space the grip away from the receiver. And I shimmed the Gearbox Shell like this. I shimmed it with this in mind, and I shimmed it with those shims on the grip. So all of this being said, my bevel gear should be fine. My pinion gear should be at the right angle and at the right height to meet the bevel gear appropriately. And it should sound pretty good because the angle should be as appropriate as possible, kind of like, the pinion gear coming up like this as opposed to the pinion gear coming up like this. So they're at the appropriate angle, it's at the appropriate height, even taking into account the shims I used on the grip, and a motor height, and all this should be good. Last but not least about this build is the motor choice. So he sent with the gun this motor, which looks to be one of the motors you can buy on Brill Armory. It looks like an SHS type motor where it comes with this drilled out neodymium can, and I would assume he put a 22 TPA armature in here, but I'm not entirely sure. Anyway, got this motor, couldn't get it to work. I tried shimming it. It was really tight out of the box. So I tried shimming it, still didn't want to work, and I tried reversing polarity, still didn't want to work. Looked at the arm, didn't see anything wrong with it. Looked at all of the wires, didn't see anything wrong with it. Cleaned up the commutator, didn't work, so nothing was working for it at all. It didn't work in any other build that I tried it in. So I swapped it out for a 22 TPA ASG motor, and these motors are wicked awesome. Trigger response is awesome, rate of fire is going to be really awesome on this build, yada yada yada. Anyway, just want to say, I swapped it out. The pinion on this motor is in almost mint condition. It has been used a couple times in different test run builds to test out these motors, but the pinion is really good. Yeah, ASG motors are really cool, and we're going to see how it sounds in this build. Alright, so I've got the lower setup all put back together. You can see our gears in there, they're wiggling around just a little bit. And here is the battery I'll be using. It's a 11 volt LiPo, 4.5 amps at 45 to 90C discharge. So this is semi. As you can hear, it sounds really good. Alright, full auto. And it could just go all day like that. Now the reason why it's stopping instantly like that as opposed to continuing to rotate, overspin, is simply because of the Gate Titan MOSFET does have constant, very light active braking. Not entirely sure what the rationale was in adding active braking. I actually don't know if you can disable it. Pretty sure you can't. But yeah, it is in there. It does kind of help out with trigger response. It makes it really nice and snappy as it resets to the exact same spot. Or very close to it. Yep. There it is. That little stoppage right there was where I let off the trigger just a little bit. Alright, there you have it. So there is part 1 of 3 for this DSG build series. In part 2, we're going to be going over the upper portion of the Gearbox Shell, and we'll actually be cycling the full gun. Like I said at the beginning of this video, I've actually already completed this build, but I'm not going to show you guys everything. I'm going to kind of release everything piece by piece, so I can make each part a little bit longer to talk about more of what I did in each part. I've noticed in the comments, and some people kind of message me occasionally and ask for very specific videos like this. They want more build series type videos, so I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. But that's gonna have to do it for today. This is the part 1 of 3 for the DSG build series. I'll see you guys in the next video.